first publications that I had a chance to look at was this thing called Municipal Facts. I don't know whether the rest of you have seen this, but this is Municipal Facts 14. We've got the history of them in the office next door. And I read through it and I was like, wow, this is some great information, some great analysis, and really kind of speaks to some of the fiscal challenges that Janesville is currently experiencing with levy limits, with shared revenue, and kind of how we stack up against our 15 peer communities. And so I asked my trusty assistant there, Max, said, where did this thing come from? Who's in charge of this? And he said, oh, it's a guy by the name of Todd Berry, and he's like, a superstar, well known in the state. He said, we need to get him here to talk to our city leaders. And so, I'm pleased to welcome Todd Berry to the City of Janesville. We're excited to hear what you have to say, but we thank you for your service here in the state, and frankly for telling it like it is, because I think that a lot of people have some misperceptions out there, and we appreciate your perspective, and we look forward to hearing your presentation today. So please welcome Mr. Todd Berry.
Well, good morning. I'm going to pass off to you something that circulates through the crowd just as background. As this goes around, just a little bit of background on me and the organization I head. And by the way, what you're being given is a copy of our monthly magazine. This one is on the most recent state budget, because I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There's some information about us on the side, and hopefully some of you receive our various publications, this being one of them. And then inside is our bi-weekly newsletter, which summarizes what went on December tax bills with school and technical college levies around the state. So with that, let me see if I can get this going. I should also just, on one point of personal privilege, if there are some old timers in the room, Janesville has sort of a special spot in my heart because when my wife was younger, she represented Janesville in the state legislature, Margaret Lewis. She represented the whole eastern side of Janesville and to the east. So I knew Janesville earlier in life, almost street by street. But anyway, it's good to be here. Let's see here. Okay, there we go. You folks are always interested in, how the finances are going to look, and I'm going to focus mainly on state government, but with some analogs to other forms of government, local governments in Wisconsin. I'm going to have trouble with that. Maybe I'm hitting the wrong one, huh? Do this. Hit the left one. I don't know the difference between left and right. So a quick word about the Alliance, and then the other things I'm going to talk about. First, I want to give you just a couple really big picture things, things that I've sort of perceived over the years, and once in a while encouraging you to walk in other people's shoes. I do this, by the way, when I speak to school groups, because particularly during the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of sense among school people that woe is us, we're the only ones under revenue limits, et cetera, et cetera. And I would occasionally share municipal and county and university data to suggest that maybe life wasn't as bad as they thought. And then I'm going to give you some background about the last 4 or 5 years in terms of state finances, and then talk a little bit about the state budget and major budget issues, and then close with some reflections. Big picture ideas. I've given a whole speech on this, and I'll try to do it in about 2 minutes. I think it's useful for those of us that are in and around government in Wisconsin to know just a little bit of ancient history. And in this long version of the speech, I can argue it starts with murder, death, divorce, beheading, and Henry VIII. the folks that left England in the 1600s, 1700s left because they weren't too hot on large central government. They weren't too keen on being told which church they had to worship at. So they were sort of dissidents, and they ended up in New England. And fast forward, and these are the people that ended up settling really this part of the state in particular before anybody else. And when you think about what they brought over that 300 or 400 year period, there obviously this tradition of local control is very much part of that history. A particular interest in education, both schools and higher ed, is part of that tradition. In part because literacy was important then to read the Bible back in the 16 and 1700s. And it happens, I think, that when you take these Yankees who sort of founded Wisconsin and wrote the laws and established the institutions and so forth, and then you add sort of crusty Germans and Norwegian bachelors to the mix, they all have sort of some similar political values, and you stir that up and you get the politics of Wisconsin in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And of course, one of those events was the creation of the nation's first income tax and the whole beginning of revenue sharing. Now it's gone through many changes and so forth. The other thing that's interesting in terms of finance in Wisconsin is the central role that the property tax plays in the state, much more so than other parts of the country. And another part of our sort of New England baggage, if you will, and even English baggage, the central part of the property tax. If you look at where the property tax is important in the U.S., it tends to be in that greater New England area that became the North in the Civil War. And there was interest also in issues of tax equity and so forth, and that was the beginning of the income tax. Since that time, you have this strange way we do government in Wisconsin, which is not like a lot of other states. You have states like New Hampshire that pretty much are locally governed. The old New England town meeting, heavy reliance on the property tax, no income or sales tax. At the other end, you have someplace like Hawaii, where pretty much everything is run by state government. And there's not a tradition of local government. We're this hybrid where ever since the creation of the income tax and then the subsequent creation of the sales tax, you essentially have a majority of the revenues being raised by government in Wisconsin being raised at the state level, but the majority of the services being delivered at the local level. And what holds the whole thing together historically was various aid systems, what was shared taxes, now shared revenues, and road aids and so forth. So a long digression into history, but I think it's worthwhile just to remember that there are some reasons that we are the way we are. Another thing that I think is useful to know is Wisconsin as the reputation as a high tax, relatively high service state, and I sort of call this my funnel theory. And when you think about how you fund government, you can borrow, of course, but we'll set that one aside. You can get money from the federal government, or you can raise taxes or fees yourself. And when you look at Wisconsin, we have never been a big fan of the sales tax, and part of that goes back to all this cultural and religious and historical stuff. We don't compete well for federal money, and haven't, and most of the Midwest and Upper New England doesn't either. And we also have had an aversion historically to funding things with user fees. We don't have toll roads. Believe it or not, the way we fund higher education in the state was traditionally a low kind of tuition, high amount of state money going into the system, and to some degree it's still that way. We tend to be a little bit below average in tuition. So we don't use user fees either to the degree other states do. So the point I'm trying to make here is look at all the things government can fund itself with. Don't do well with federal money, don't particularly like the sales tax, aren't really enamored with user fees. What's left? Income taxes and sales taxes. And in both cases, we're in the top tier of states in the country on both of those, in both 20-25% above the national average. But it's the choices we've made historically, politically over the years that have put us there. Ironically, the latest census data for Wisconsin says in terms of what we spend, we're a fairly average state. We're sort of in the middle. But because of those two taxes where we're unusually high, that's where we get our reputation. Nobody mentions that we're 35th in the country on the sales tax, or in that bottom tier in terms of receipt of federal money and so forth. One final sort of big picture thing that I think is worth mentioning, and particularly since transportation has become such an issue in the last few years, and Lord knows that it's an issue around here at the moment because of I-39, I-90, and that is Wisconsin is very unusual in that we spend more than any other state in the country on local roads. Less on state, but here again is that sort of local control, a decentralized kind of impulse, but it also has to do with the whole dairy legacy and building farm-to-market roads and paving them way back when. And we have more miles of paved roads at the local level, I think, than any other state in the country, which is sort of surprising. Okay, so that's sort of the history and all that. Quickly on some background leading up to where we are now. Needless to say, if you look back over the last 20 years, and this is just general fund deficits and surpluses at the state level, you can say that we don't keep the ship on sort of an even keel and straight course. We're up, we're down. It's very volatile, and that period in the middle is the recessionary period, coming off some big surpluses where back in the 90s, where frankly we overcommitted, overpromised, and then ended up holding the bag. The other thing you'll notice is that every time the economy improves and we get some money in the bank, we can't stand it in the capital. Okay? We've got to do something with the money. So that first big spike there in the 90s is when the state blew up the school finance system and said it was going to fund 2/3 of K-12 education. And look what happened. At the time, I said we couldn't afford it, that it wouldn't work in the long run, and sure enough, the notion was repealed in the early 2000s. The other big spike there is coming off the 2011, 12, 13 state budget, a very austere budget, and it had to be because it was inheriting a lot of really difficult financial issues. But the combination of the recovery and the austerity meant that over 11, 12, 13, 14, we had some fairly significant surpluses. And here we go again. We managed to do things to get rid of them, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. Now, there's another chart here that I want to share that sort of tells the same story, but is more important to think about in terms of why the state has seemed to have recurring budget problems. This is not surpluses and deficits, which can include carryover money from prior years. This is just revenues and expenditures in a single year. Are the revenues more or less than the expenditures? And you can see we're all over the place. So there's a lot of years where we're spending more than we're bringing in, and one of those years is usually followed by a year or two of retrenchment. And so it's up and down and up and down. And the final drop there was going into the 2015 budget. So we're inheriting essentially a lot of unpaid bills, a lot of unpaid commitments. And I'll talk about some of those in a minute. In the end, that number got a little bit better when the state closed its books on fiscal 15 by a couple $100 million. But the ups and downs of that are fairly clear. In addition to sort of the numerical notion of how we got to now, just some review of what was going on. One thing you'll find about the legislature and governors in this state is when they are told that they are going to have more money than they thought, a feeding frenzy results. And usually they get that word in a state budget period in May of an odd numbered year. And during the recovery, we were underestimating revenues, and so there was a little extra. And so when they got the good news in May 11, they started a phased corporate income tax cut, which is still going on. When they got the news in May of 13, the governor had proposed about a $300 million income tax cut. The legislature doubled it because there was some extra money around. Now, giving credit to the legislature, it was one of the few times they also did something that government very rarely does, and they actually did some cleaning up of the state income tax and got rid of a whole mass of junk that was hardly used and was just cluttering up the forms. Did they go far enough? No, but in addition to the tax cut, they got rid of some stuff. They found they were going to have more money in the fall of that year when the state closed its books, so they quickly ran $100 million extra into the school aid formula to buy down property taxes. The most recent news goes back to January 14th, and it's these two events that explain why the state had so much budget difficulty in the last year or two. In January of 14, the legislature came back and was told, they also estimate revenues in January, was told that the state would have almost $1 billion surplus. Well, it's party time. So, in addition to a small income tax, which actually was focused on the lowest tax bracket, on lower incomes, the big thing they did was they took over $400 million and they put it into state aid to technical colleges. Now, this was really a revolution, and nobody really noticed it, in that we went from being a technical college system that was where the state was very much a minority shareholder in terms of funding, and the local property tax was the biggie. Just flipped that completely around, where the state became the major funder. And again, they added almost $400 million, well, more than $400 million to technical college aid. Now, they characterized that, and remember, this was an election year, 2014. They characterized this as a big property tax cut. And it was. I mean, in the end, technical college levies dropped by almost 50%, and overall tax bills statewide dropped by a couple percentage points. But the flip side of this is they bought that tax cut, okay? They used state surplus money to permanently, year after year after year, put money into technical colleges. Well, they came back in January 15, and they were told, oops, we don't have $1 billion surplus. We overestimated by $500 million. So suddenly they're going into a new state budget with half of the state surplus they thought they had gone, and the other half essentially spent aiding technical colleges. And the other thing about this technical college change is not only did they make that commitment on December 14, December 14 tax bills, and again 15 and so forth, so that they were having to spend that money year after year after year to maintain that property tax buy down. Now, a lot of stuff here that probably goes a little bit too detailed, but the long and the short of it is they were in a pretty good position. They didn't estimate revenues right, and they made a huge permanent commitment in terms of the way they were going to fund technical colleges. And suddenly you don't have any surplus. Here's a little tidbit. If they had not done the technical college property tax buy-down in January, February, March of 14, they wouldn't have spent that $400 million surplus. They also wouldn't have made a $400 million spending commitment this year and next year into the future. In other words, if you take that act away, they would have been going into this budget with over $1 billion surplus. And instead they went into it with a deficit, essentially, which they can't by law, and they had to move some deck chairs to fix. But here's the result, the 2015-17 budget. And without getting into the detail, the state budget is sort of like an onion. There's this outside of it, which is federal money and user fees and everything. And then inside that is the general fund budget, and that's the budget that we usually read about, that the legislators talk about, and so forth. That's about a $30+ billion budget over a 2-year period. The state budget's on a 2-year period, and $15-16 billion a year. Now, interesting things about this new state budget that you were nervously observing being developed. One thing is the amount of new tax revenues in this biennium that was estimated was not insignificant. It was about $2 billion of new income and sales tax dollars that were going to come in. So why wasn't there any money? Well, first of all, we had to fill the holes in commitments from the prior budget. And then we also we are spending $1 billion of new money in this state budget. Where is it going? Basically to one place. It's not going to you. It's not going to the university. It's not going to schools. Anybody care to guess what's the remaining big state program? Medicaid. Healthcare for low-income individuals and elderly folks in nursing homes. Of the $1 billion of new money this state budget is spending, 2/3 of it is going to Medicaid, $600 to $700 million. And that has been the story of state budgets really now for multiple budgets. If you look sort of at the sweep of history, the state was spending a lot of money on shared revenues in the university in the 70s and into the 80s. Then we had this get tough on crime period, and there was more funding going into corrections. And then we had this big school tax buy-down, and money flowed into school aids. Incidentally, that's about when shared revenues were frozen and the decline began. And what the new era has not been shared revenues, it hasn't been the university, it hasn't been schools, it's been Medicaid. And it's been that way for a number of years now. We have 3 times as many, well, maybe slightly less now with the recovery, people on Medicaid in Wisconsin now than we did in 1998, because we kept expanding eligibility. The other part of this budget is there's some bonding in it. There's about $600+ million. That'll end up being more like $900 million, $1 billion, because of the fighting over the transportation money. That's a whole other story that I'll get to in a minute. So that's sort of the budget in terms of a few numbers. This is sort of how you'd look at it in detail, and I'll spare you the agony, but you can think of it in 3 parts. The leftover money coming in, and then the new money, that's the revenues, and then where we're spending money, that's the appropriations, and then what's left over is the balances. And the reason this budget was so tight was we started budgeting for this fiscal year with no money. There was no carryover surplus. The other thing that you'll notice is that when you drop down where that yellow arrow is down to the bottom, we're ending this budget period with a surplus of over 100 million. Now that may sound like a lot to a department head in Janesville, but $100 million in state general fund is a spit in the Rock River. I mean, it's 0.8% of what they spend in a year. The last time I saw that percentage get that low was the Doyle budget in 2008, when Wisconsin had the lowest surpluses of any state in the country except Arkansas. And so I'm sure I got the current folks in the Capitol rather angry at me, just like I probably got the Doyle folks angry at me when I said these reserves are so low. If anything goes wrong, we're in big trouble. You know, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to say that. The other thing that's interesting about this budget, if you look at the new revenues and the new spending, and you compare the two, actually we're spending more than we're bringing in revenue. The same old story. Very small surpluses and not a terribly sustainable, balanced kind of system. Now the good news is the economy seems to be continuing along, so hopefully we won't hit the skids. But the economy, the signals are so mixed. You could very well read headlines when the Legislative Fiscal Bureau re-estimates revenue, actually probably later this month. The surplus could be higher, it could be lower. It's hard to say. These are the state's largest programs, and both in terms of the all funds budget, the outside of the onion, and the general fund budget, the state tax funded budget on the right. And the long and the short of it is, and this is by department, not by program, the Department of Health Services, which is Medicaid, is a big share of the budget. I can remember days when it was under 10%. Medicaid is now over 15, and the whole department is over 20. DPI, public instruction, mainly school aids, is about a third of the budget. The UW in this budget is about 6%. It's been bouncing around 6, 7, 8%. I can remember a time back in 1970 when that percentage was 17%. So the notion that the university is under fiscal stress, in a sense, is not new. Both parties, every governor, every legislature for 40 years has been slowly backing away from the amount of state budget it puts into the UW, and what they've essentially been allowing until this tuition freeze is to allow tuition to rise. So that's that story. The rest of these things here, just to quickly mention, what is the transportation fund doing in the general fund budget, since we have a transportation fund? The answer is, just like the prior governor raided the transportation fund to subsidize the general fund, this governor has taken general fund money to put it in the transportation fund to subsidize it, and that's why you're seeing general fund money showing up there. That second category with the blue or purple dot, I'm colorblind, is shared revenue and related property tax credits, and really that has not grown and has been on a decline. Corrections has basically settled in. It's still one of the state's major programs, but it's not exploding in growth. The new thing on here in terms of the state's largest programs is technical colleges. It's not a huge share, but that never used to show up. So that's the result of that little party they had back in March of 14. So I think I've really touched on the major issues. Some Medicaid is the biggie in terms of pressure on money now. K-12 school aids and revenue limits on schools are an issue every year. If they don't put money into Medicaid, if they have some money left over, they'll probably put it in school aids. And there were some technical issues about the budget and how the governor put it together in terms of school finance that I won't go into. But in the last couple budgets, the way the governor has proposed school finance has been, in some ways, sort of odd, and the legislature generally would fix it. And the reason is partly political, in that when you look around the state and see the school districts that are having declining enrollment pressures and therefore are under financial pressure, they tend to be outstate, and almost all of them tend to be in Republican Senate districts. That's why when the governor's budget gets to the Senate, it gets changed in the school area. Transportation was the other big issue, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The issue has been now for a couple of years, do we borrow or do we actually fund the transportation system? And the final issue here, the biggie, was the UW system. What the governor originally opposed was sort of a give and take, in that he proposed more autonomy for the university system in how it was going to make decisions in bonding, tuition, and so forth. And the flip side of that was, he felt, and the university felt too to some degree, that it could generate savings from doing that. So the governor was giving authority and taking money. From day one I said, this ain't going to happen. The legislature won't give the university authority, and they'll still take the money. And that's exactly what happened. Okay, just a couple other things, and I'll start to wrap things up here. I think this is a useful slide for you to show what has happened in school finance over the last 20 years. In a sense, it's what happened to shared revenues before that. Shared revenues got under pressure back here in the mid-90s. See those big red bars going up? Those are massive increases in state school aids. Well, if they're putting money into school aids, they're not putting into shared revenue. The other thing you'll notice, though, is those bars get smaller and smaller and smaller, and actually get negative and have stayed fairly low. In other words, the average annual growth in the school aid formula is getting pretty modest. It's very much a departure. So, in a sense, school aids is the new shared revenue. Shared revenue has been frozen and cut for 20 years. School aids is now entering that same kind of experience. If you look at the blue line, the amount of school aid over the last 5-6 years has essentially been flat. It hasn't grown at all. So, welcome to the world of shared revenue. The other thing is, there was a time when the schools were under revenue limits, but those revenue limits were allowed to grow by inflation and enrollment, and that's the blue line, that growth. Well, the enrollment growth stopped, and when the state couldn't put money into school aids, it started clamping down on the revenue limits. And so as a result, there has been really no change in school revenue limits either. Another example, I think, of how the K-12 school picture is sort of evolving into the municipal county kind of picture as well. Now, a couple words on transportation. This is probably the big issue. I mean, Medicaid is always sitting there, and nobody seems to want to tackle what would really be major discussions you need to have in terms of how to slow the growth in Medicaid spending. But so this is the big issue now. It will be the big issue in the next budget. It's not a new issue. We've had gubernatorial and legislative commissions and task forces studying transportation every few years going back into the 90s. They always sort of recommend some of the same things, and it never happens. It's interesting that actually the way we fund transportation is not necessarily bad. We have a gas tax. Yes, it's one of the higher in the country, but we also have vehicle registration fees, which are some of the lower in the country, and together, you know, it balances out. But those revenues aren't growing. In fact, they're flat to declining for all sorts of reasons. The Wisconsin population is getting older, it's not driving as much. Vehicles are becoming more energy efficient. People argue, whether it's true or not, I don't know yet, that millennials are somehow transporting themselves in different ways, or living in city centers or whatever. But really, when you think about it, our gas tax and our vehicle registration fees are our tolls, like Illinois. And they're not growing at all and haven't really grown much at all for 5 or 6, 7 years. So we've got a system that asphalt goes up in price, wages go up, and the revenue sources are basically stagnant. Now, it's interesting that while the legislature and the governor don't want to talk about adjusting the gas tax or the vehicle registration fees, even for inflation, the state get the sales tax and income tax revenues that grow automatically every year with wages and the economy. So the general fund that the legislature perhaps cares more about automatically grows 3, 4, 5, 6% per year. There were times in the 90s when it grew 8, 9, 10% a year. But we can't seem to come to grips with gas taxes and vehicle registration fees. I'm not one to argue that the gas tax is such a bad thing. It's just our version of tolls. I have to digress for a minute. Just a quick question. How many of you have I-passes? Now, just keep your hands up and look around the room. Now, I asked this question in Wisconsin Rapids and got a third to half of the hands. Okay, I can understand you guys. It's the same all over practically all over the state. I've asked it in Eau Claire and got a quarter to a third of the hand. I would argue that the people of the state are way ahead of the politicians. We've already decided that we don't mind thinking of transportation sort of the way we think of natural gas or electricity. It's metered and we get a bill. And we could do that here. And I think that's where we'll end up, but I think it'll be a long time getting there. I've already talked about all the raids and counter raids, and one of the other problems as a result is road aids in the transportation fund are getting to be a little bit smaller part of the transportation budget year after year. And that's what prompted us, by the way, the League of Municipalities and the counties in something together called the Local Government Institute last year asked us to study transportation finance in the state, particularly with reference to local governments. And I'm not going to go into that, but that study's available on the League website. If it isn't up there anymore, I'd be happy to share a copy with you. But we had proposed a lot of ways to maybe address the local transportation finance problem, premised on the notion that we're not going to see a major change in the way the state is doing the transportation fund. So what have we been doing? We've been borrowing. And the graph on the left is just the amount of borrowing. You'll see back way on the left there, we weren't borrowing a lot for transportation. But Governor Doyle had some billion-plus budgets, a couple of them. Walker has come close a couple times, and the budget he proposed, which is the dashes there on the right, was about $1.3 billion in borrowing. The legislature balked, so they didn't increase gas taxes or user fees, and they just cut off back half the bonding, and you know the story locally about projects being delayed and so forth. I'm not going to go into this graph on the right. The governor did something very sort of rhetorically clever by saying, well, we're not borrowing anymore, and the reason is he didn't put a dime of new borrowing into any other state program. Just wiped it to zero. Typically, the state spends about $1 billion in a budget for general obligation bonding for university buildings, prisons, and so forth. He just delayed all that. So there's another thing that's going to be coming back. So all this story, history, culture, state budgets, blah, 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 I think this is sort of an interesting little chart. This is county and municipal spending per capita. And the counties are in blue, the munis are in red, and you can see they're growing during the 80s and 90s, and then they start to slow as the shared revenue growth stops with the school tax buy down. And then really starting with these repeated budget crises. Remember the early slides with the ups and downs and ups and downs. That's what, when you get budget crisis, you can see that road aids not growing, shared revenue not growing, tighter levy limits from 2006 and then 2011 on, essentially a freeze. You can see what is being spent per person in the state at the local levels dropping. And I think we're coming to a point now where, Act 10 helped schools particularly, and to some degree municipalities and counties, absorb some of this aid freeze and decline. Whatever savings were to be gotten out of that are now past. You lived with multiple years of close to levy freezes, if not. So we're now getting into the position where the rubber meets the road. The state population is getting older. We are going to see more retirements. We're going to see more employee retention issues. And that's going to start to be a big question for local governments. And it'll be interesting to see how the state responds to that. And this is all because we have this strange system of state taxing and local service delivery with all sorts of historical antecedents. Just a couple of final slides. Does anybody care about the fact that the state budgets are very narrowly balanced and are quite up and down, and we seem to lurch from crisis to crisis? Well, there are a couple folks that care. These are the bond ratings of various states. The blue bars for the three houses are the number of states, and this is last year at this time, that had bond ratings higher than Wisconsin. The white bars there on the right are the number of states that had bond ratings lower than Wisconsin. And the blue bars in the middle, the darker, are the ones that had same as Wisconsin. The long and the short of it is what the bond markets have been saying about Wisconsin since 2000 is you guys don't entirely have your fiscal house in order. They've never, our bond ratings were dropped back then and they've never been raised. Despite the rhetoric you'll hear from some folks, in fact, they have not been raised. Another way to look at this is our CAFR, our financial statements, and the new one just came out before Christmas. And here's sort of a history of the deficits in the general fund, in the CAFR, in the financial statements, and the difference is an accounting one in that they're done according to generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP, which undoes some of the timing and financial tricks that the state sometimes uses to balance its budget. And what you see here is that the GAAP deficits grew pretty consistently during the prior decade, hit $3 billion negative at the end of the last governor. To the credit of this governor, he had some surpluses for a while, and those surpluses allowed them to start to bring the GAAP deficit back down. We halved it by last year, but surprise, we don't have any more surpluses. We don't have any extra savings around. So of course, the GAAP deficit is going to start to grow again, and it did. It went from about 1.4 billion to about 1.8 billion negative. That is a way to compare the relative financial health of states. And when you look around the country, there are only about 6 states with GAAP deficits. A number of those, or maybe 9 now, but anyway, most of them are pretty small, and they don't last very long. But 3 states have relatively large GAAP deficits: Illinois, California, Wisconsin, and we're number 3. And we've been number 1, number 2, number 3 for quite a while. So here's sort of the questions. What are we going to do about Medicaid? With local government generally, can we continue to have them on this diet that we've had them on forever? What are we going to do with transportation? And are we going to come up with some kind of sustainable solution for higher education and K-12 education? What we seem to be into at the moment is sort of legislative micromanagement and no predictability about funding. When I talk to school people, they say, we don't care if our aides don't grow too much. We can live with that. We don't like it, but we can look the other way. But when they go like this, because the state is having financial problems, it's totally unpredictable. We don't know what's coming. Could you at least give us some certainty? Final reflection, and I won't go into all this. Why do we do this? Why have we, for the last 20 years, lurched from budget crisis to budget crisis in Wisconsin? I started getting asked this question way back in the late 90s, and the only thing I've been able to come up with is this sort of theory, and I may be all wet. I tend to take a very organizational, structural view of the world. In other words, the way you design government, the way you design public organizations, the way you write rules and laws determine behavior. Well, what we have done in Wisconsin over the last 40 years is we've created a system of career professional state politics. And what that has done is greatly centralized partisan political power in the capital, in the leaders, and has really made it hard for people in the back benches. They have to toe the line, or their bills won't go anywhere, they won't chair committees, they'll be ostracized, and as has happened on both sides of the aisle, they'll essentially be kicked out. We've had legislators on both sides of the aisle that have had to run as independents because their party leaders didn't want them. So it's a very careerist, polarized, gridlocked kind of process. When you depend on the legislature as your primary source of income, and the pay isn't bad, but the benefits are pretty good, your time horizon is always going to be very short. 6 months, 9 months, 18 months, the next election. And if you can push problems off, you'll push them off. And that's the only explanation I can come up with. So, there you go. A sweep through everything from 1560 to 2017, 2018, 2019. Yes, sir.
Could you talk a bit about the state's rejection of federal money regarding Medicaid, about $345 million?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was state rejection of federal Medicaid money. I know that a big deal of this is made in the Capitol. To be honest, probably too big a deal is made of this, and here's why I say that. If we had that extra money, it would be an extra $150 million a year. It would be nice to have. I mean, it certainly would have made this budget easier, but remember, the reason this budget was tough was not because we did or did not take the Medicaid money, it's the decisions we made about technical colleges and taxation. Should we take the money? I mean, that's a great debate. And the two sides make these arguments. The governor says, the federal budget is not in balance. It's going to start getting worse and worse and worse as the Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid financial pressures get worse and worse. I don't feel comfortable taking the federal money because they're just going to walk away from it. That's his argument. Now, was there another reason he was making this argument? Think back a year. Perhaps there was. It certainly was a political argument as well. The other side, makes a reasonable argument that, well, You know, we don't compete well for federal money anyway. If we can get 150 million a year from the feds, let's take it. And if they end up screwing us in a couple of years, well, it's only 150 million in a 15, 16 billion dollar budget. We've made much larger problems for ourselves, so let's take it. So, you know, I think there's a temptation on one side to paint this as totally in ideological terms, and the other side to paint it as the panacea that will solve the budget crisis. And, you know, I can sort of see either way, but, you know, when you have an $800 million surplus and you plunge yourself to what was going to be a $300 million deficit in 2 years, you know, you did that, not, I mean, the legislature and the government did that. 150 million a year would have been nice, but it wouldn't have solved the problem. And by the way, if it had come, it would have, of course, gone to Medicaid, and whether some money would have filtered out the bottom of Medicaid to go to other folks is sort of a question. And how it would get divvied up. My argument would be that let history predict, and that is when the legislature has had extra money in the last 10 to 15 years, they put it in the school level. Which I know is not what you want to hear, but. Other questions? Yes, sir.
As you mentioned, local governments are hamstringed by
Yeah.
levy limits. And I know that we've attempted locally to have referendums to exceed that. Have you seen any trend that have more localities try that, and how successful have they been?
I think we're in that stage where, you know, the municipalities have, you know, had a couple years. Maybe they got a little help from Act 10. Maybe they had a little bit of stored up surplus or an extra employee they could, you know, get. In other words, they've sort of crawled by for a couple of years, and we're getting to that situation where, you know, there's not going to be any easy answer. Trends. I don't see it emerging at the municipal and county level yet, but you can see the discussions are starting to happen. And this is sort of reminiscent of school revenue caps in the 90s. You started to see districts going to referendum in 93, 94, 95, 96. Now, they were passing building referenda, but they were not passing revenue cap referenda. What has happened is that declining enrollment picture became clearer and clearer. By the way, in any 1 year, 2/3 of the school districts in Wisconsin are losing enrollment. That is something you should be thinking about. Add 20 years to those people's, to the kindergartners' lives, and think about who they are and what the implications are for tax paying and workforce and everything. So I think what's been going on in schools in the last 5 to 10 years is very interesting. What you've seen is schools not going to permanent exemptions from revenue tax, but asking for 3 or 4 or 5 years of relief, and then they'd have to go back to the voters. And it used to be that the chances of one of those referenda passing would be like, you know, they'd pass 40% of the time, 50% of the time, you know, sort of a crapshoot. In the last 2 to 3 years, whether it's the improvement of the economy or some sense that there's some new stresses on K-12 education or whatever, better storytelling by school boards and local administrators. It's interesting, the last couple of years, those 3-year, 4-year, 5-year revenue cap referenda have been passing like 70, 75, 80% of them. That tells me that for a while, when a crisis starts to emerge, the public is sort of skeptical and isn't sure what it, you know, wants to do. They don't want to write some kind of blank check, so they don't want They don't want to give a permanent revenue cap relief, but they'll do it for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And I think the difference is there's been in the news long enough that, revenue limits were actually cut and have been pretty much frozen, and school aids have not grown, and local districts and taxpayers can start to see the effects. Extraneous things have gone away. Certain sports maybe have gone away or been co-opted with another district. Whatever. They can see evidence in their lives that says, oh, maybe there is a problem. And I think just as the school finance picture in terms of aid and revenue caps is on a slightly different cycle than municipalities, I think in terms of referenda, you may be on a slightly different cycle too, and sort of be following them. So I don't know what to think, but when you have to start making decisions about how many inches of snow are you going to have before you can plow, or how often are you going to do garbage collection, or what is the response time going to be for a police or a fire call, whatever. I mean, when you start having those kinds of discussions, and people can see things touching themselves, then they're going to start to say, maybe this isn't all whining. Maybe I'm hearing something that has some substance to it. And then you can have a discussion. And I'll tell you, the thing that I've learned about school referenda is, and which is, by the way, I think this bill that's before the legislature to not allow school districts to hold a referendum if they've held one in the last year or two is not a particularly good idea for a very democratic small d reason. What I find in school referenda is that they're conversations between the district and the voters, whether it's building or revenue caps. They'll put something up, it'll get defeated, and the school board and the administrators will sort of listen out. What was wrong? What did we do wrong? Did they not want us to build this? Did they not want the revenue cap exceedance to be 5 years? Did they want it to be 3? In other words, so then the district goes back, and the referendum may pass, and if it doesn't, then you may have another round of discussion, and in a sense it's a discussion around the ballot box, and then maybe on the third attempting. So I think we're sort of going to evolve into that kind of model, just as we did in schools and municipalities and counties. You have an interesting situation because, unlike schools, you did not have the freedom with Act 10 that schools did, because of course, typically your largest or second largest expenditure is going to be police and fire, and you're still living in a pre-Act 10 world there. So it's a little different, but I don't know. I hope that's just sort of my thinking of watching school referenda over 20 years.
Right. I mean, as far as local governments, you see the same trend that maybe cities will go several times over.
Well, they might. I mean, but lessons that I've learned as a guy that many years ago was in marketing and public relations, and that is, and from watching school referenda, there are a couple things that the public really doesn't like. They don't like exaggeration, and they don't like to be lied to. And so the most important asset that a municipality or a county has, or a school district has, is public trust. You will get serious discussion of referenda you will get referenda passed if there's a sense of believability and trust. I am amazed when some school districts still will have some debt coming off, and they'll want to go back and bond for some new debt. And they will tell the public, your taxes aren't going to go up, there's no new debt. And you know, they're really playing a bait and switch here, where they're taking the benefit of some debt coming off to put some new debt on, without having then the discussion of, is the new debt justifiable? And that kind of, those kind of, you know, bait and switch kind of games, you know, might work once, but when you get called on them, then you've done something far worse than passing a referendum. You've jeopardize that intangible asset, the trust, where you can have reasonable discussions with the public. I think people on the whole are fairly reasonable and fairly rational if the dialogue is conducted in a sense of openness and trust. And I think that's my point with the school referendum data is exactly that. You saw those pass rates rising. Long answers to short questions. I don't know, how are we doing, Mark?
We're doing good. We're doing good. I do have a question.
Okay.
I think it's something that,
Because I've been up here for a long time and they're probably sick of me.
eating it up. The question that I've got relates to shared revenue, and this is something that, the city struggles with. Janesville currently at $81 per resident in shared revenue. The average of our 15 peer communities is 174, twice as much as Janesville. And so Janesville loses out from that freeze that happened back in the early 2000s. And so we've been dealing with our state legislators, we written letters to the governor, we talked with the league about, hey, let's just turn it back on and let the chips fall where they may. And my question is are we wasting our time, or is there a chance out there that we could see effective change?
I can't give you too much reason for hope. Honesty builds trust. The appropriation as a whole has been frozen and cut now for 20 plus years. In 2000, 2001, somewhere in there, the appropriation, the formula was essentially turned off. And so whatever you had is what you got, and if there was some growth in the appropriation, everybody would grow at the same rate. And I think that that is a situation that probably a lot of legislators are more comfortable with because it's predictable. Well, we're not going to cut you, What goes on in the school aid formula, which is running and redistributive, is amazing. I mean, you can see huge swings in aid from year to year and levies from year to year, depending on who's doing what in one district that's affecting another. It's all very redistributive. Is the shared revenue formula working the way it's was supposed to since the 1970s? No. It's been frozen. It's been lasting time. The school aid formula hasn't. And I just don't see, I can't see anything that would change that unless you had a situation where you had more money. Because one thing about politics in the Capitol is if there's more money, they'll grease the skids and pay off the losers and rewrite a formula and so forth. They do that all the time with schools. But in this environment, Medicaid's at the top of the line, school aids has been pushed to second, and the next big programs are shared revenue, university, corrections, and none of them are faring as well. So the shorter answer to your question is I can't be too optimistic. So what you have is an interesting situation where you have Janesville, which historically was more tax-based healthy, and under the shared revenue formula got less aid, and you had a city like Beloit that was tax-based poor and was locked in there at a very high shared revenue amount. And frankly, if the formula were allowed to work, I don't know if things would change that much. But now you obviously had one major shock to your system, but I don't know, when that happened and I was invited down here to speak, I think by Forward Janesville or something, I said, Janesville, there are only certain communities in the state have a really strong sense of civic self and sort of work together and get things done, and I think Janesville tends to be one of those communities. So I think in the long run, Kenosha's the proof that in the long run you'll probably be better off because you'll have a much more diversified economic base. But getting from point A to point B is really not fun. So,
Any other questions? Nothing? Last question for you then.
Okay.
You mentioned local sales tax or sales tax. And, our question here is, we run the numbers, the state gets 5%, county gets a 0.5%. If the municipality was allowed to have a 0.5% sales tax, the city of Janesville would see a revenue stream of about $7 million, which would solve all of our problems. So my question is, again, we're taking that to our legislators and to the governor. Is there any chance of that gaining some traction, perhaps?
well, I'm going to rain on your parade for a different reason now, and that is, I'm not sure it's a good idea, and let me tell you why. The Kettle Commission, back in 2000, sort of went in this direction, and I wrote a dissent to that, and here's what I sort of said. I said, I'm not sure that sales taxes make sense at a municipal level, particularly in more urbanized counties and areas, because you can get into this differential rates. I mean, if you have a county that doesn't have a sales tax, and you have a county that does, and they're next to each other, and one city has a municipal tax and one doesn't, you start to get differentials in rates. And I think that has the potential on the margin with higher ticket items for people to start, for retailers to start playing games and saying you can save X% on your car if you come here rather than there. My own view of this is how to solve your problem, which is, I think, is too smart to ever happen. I think it makes a lot of sense for municipalities to have property taxes. You provide property-related services, it's sort of a user fee. The problem is not you guys. It's that what are we doing funding state forests with a state property tax, and still tech colleges to some degree with a property tax, and counties, human services, which is mainly what they do, with a property tax. And it seems to me that if you were thinking about this rationally, that what the state should do is find ways to diversify the revenue base and use that sales tax, and then get fingers out of the property tax pie so you can be the primary legitimate user. Now, I mean, do people like property taxes? No. But that would be my solution. It's not recognizing we don't have a problem. If we're going to do something for municipalities, I guess I would prefer to do it on a county level, with the county then being required to distribute the money to the individual municipalities. The only reason I say that is then you don't get into these border wars between Janesville and Milton or Janesville and Beloit or whatever. So, yeah.
Well, we're going to wrap it up.
Okay.
And, Dr. Berry, I wanted to say thank you very much for your time, for the presentation, enlightening. I know that we're all better educated and informed than we were an hour and a half ago. And so what I wanted to present to you is one of our city coins. We're going to shake hands and I'm going to pass it to you. Okay?
Sort of like the oar.
Yeah.
Or
There you go.
paddle.
Paddle, that's right. But thank you very much for the presentation.